If you're a man whose mind works swiftly and incisively, chances are you've noticed it already. The silence that follows your words, the subtle flicker of unease in people's eyes, the way conversations seem to wither the moment you decide not to water them with pretense. You don't need to voice these observations. You feel them instinctively, deep within. As your intelligence sharpened, the company around you dwindled. What once seemed like coincidence began to feel inevitable. It made you question, could intelligence itself be an unwelcome quality? Not out of hubris or a sense of superiority, but because the way you perceive the world challenges the delicate fabric of unspoken social agreements holding most relationships together. Here is the discomforting reality. High intelligence does not isolate you by mere misfortune. It separates you with intent. Long before contemporary psychology coded this truth with terms like giftedness or overthinking, one thinker deciphered it with brutal clarity. Niccolò Machiavelli grasped the dynamics of human connection, not through the lens of IQ tests or personality traits, but as a chess game of power, perception, and survival. Machiavelli's writings were never interested in the rosy ideals of friendship depicted in self-help books. He studied human nature in its rawest form, stripped of its polite masks. When his logic is applied to the plight of the modern intelligent man, something unsettling becomes evident. Social solitude is not proof of failure. It is a natural consequence. Most assume that friendships are built on honesty, shared values, and mutual goodwill. But Machiavelli would argue that this assumption is a comforting illusion. People do not truly bond over raw truths. They connect through shared delusions. They avoid clarity, gravitating instead toward comfort. They rarely want to confront reality as it is. They seek validation for their worldview and reassurance for their emotions. This is where the intelligent man inadvertently becomes a disruptor. His perspective pierces deeper than most people care or dare to go. He discerns the emotions beneath actions, the intentions behind words, and the power plays camouflaged as kindness. Even in silence, his presence often unsettles others. They sense his awareness, not in a starkly menacing way, but in a primal, instinctual manner, as though he exists apart from their collective narrative, an unwilling participant in the unspoken choreography of social pretense. Machiavelli understood that relationships are rarely rooted in morality. They are built on strategy. People form bonds with those who make them feel secure, affirmed, and superior. Friendship often operates like a pact, an agreement to avoid shaking each other's inner worlds. The moment someone unintentionally breaches this agreement, be it through deeper questions, an unwillingness to conform, or a refusal to engage in emotional theatrics, they become a liability. A highly intelligent man doesn't need to flaunt knowledge or authority to undermine this unspoken bargain. His very presence can disturb the group's equilibrium. His habit of probing too deeply or hesitating when others rush forward makes him seem unpredictable or disloyal. This is why intelligent men frequently encounter rejection not in direct confrontations, but through quiet exclusion. Invitations gradually stop arriving. Messages are left unanswered. Shared jokes no longer include them. The group doesn't regard him as an adversary, but rather as a disruption, a ripple that unsettles their still waters. In such cases, as Machiavelli might point out, avoiding interaction feels safer than engaging in open confrontation. Removing the perceived threat becomes less about conflict and more about maintaining peace. This casts doubt on yet another cherished notion, that intelligence makes a person more relatable. In practice, it often renders them less comprehensible to others. Highly intelligent individuals often process life through abstract thinking, long-term consequences, and probabilities, while most social interactions hinge on emotional resonance and immediate connection. People engage in conversations to experience emotion, not necessarily to understand logic. Stories are told to create bonds, not to dissect details. Thus, when an intelligent man offers nuanced responses in place of unfiltered endorsement, or refrains from feigned outrage or unchecked enthusiasm, it can come across as detachment rather than sincerity. Machiavelli would have identified this phenomenon instantly. Appearance outweighs essence. In today's context, appearing emotionally attuned often holds more value than intellectual honesty or depth of thought. This creates an excruciating paradox. The intelligent man is frequently capable of profound loyalty, meaningful connections, and exceptional understanding. But these qualities require conditions rarely met: shared self-awareness, mutual honesty, and a tolerance for discomfort. Unfortunately, most people prioritize emotional stability over existential inquiry. Inevitably, when faced with someone whose very nature disturbs their emotional balance, whether intentionally or not, most will withdraw. And here lies a deeper layer Machiavelli wouldn't overlook. Intelligence is power. Even when wielded subtly or silently, it can pose an implicit threat to established structures and hierarchies. Within any group, there exists an unspoken hierarchy that governs dynamics, who leads discussions, whose opinions hold more weight, and who sets the emotional tone. A highly intelligent individual disrupts this order, often without conscious effort. He may not seek leadership, but others perceive that he could assume it. He may not assert dominance, but his ability to see through social power games makes others uneasy. Machiavelli warned rulers about men like these, not because they were malicious, but because their unpredictability undermines social stability. Uncertainty is the enemy of comfort. Consequently, the group compensates by categorizing him as quiet, intense, aloof, or difficult to understand. Such labels act as social tools, simplifying what is complex and making it easier to dismiss. Once labeled, he can be excluded without guilt. He's simply not that social. Over time, even the intelligent individual may internalize these judgments, mistaking them for truth rather than recognizing them as defense mechanisms. There is also the burden of foresight. Individuals with high intelligence often predict the outcomes of actions before they unfold. They see where trends are heading and detect self-destructive behaviors in others long before they manifest. This makes simple, carefree interactions difficult. How can one laugh freely while already anticipating the cost? How can one be fully present when the conclusion is already clear? Machiavelli might argue that this foresight, while invaluable, becomes isolating because it places the person outside the temporal frame most people inhabit. Others are engaged in today's game, while he is thinking 3 moves ahead. This cognitive gap creates a sense of distance. Then there is honesty, not moral honesty, but a perceptual clarity that resists pretense. Most relationships are sustained by subtle deceptions, excessive compliments, purposeful omissions, or polite ignorance. The intelligent individual often struggles with these because his mind rejects inefficiency. Lies feel wasteful, pretense feels burdensome. As a result, he speaks plainly, or not at all. Machiavelli observed that society rarely rewards harsh truths in everyday life. Such truths are only tolerated when they serve power. Otherwise, they are quietly punished. This is why many intelligent individuals across cultures and eras share a common experience of loneliness, not as a source of sadness, but as a byproduct of clarity. It's less about being misunderstood and more about being either too deeply understood or entirely overlooked. They do not seek crowds. They yearn for resonance, a connection that is uncommon. Machiavelli would caution against blindly pursuing companionship. Instead, he would advocate for understanding the terrain, that most relationships are conditional, fleeting, and transactional. To expect unconditional camaraderie in a world driven by perception is to invite disappointment. Yet it's important to note that Machiavelli did not endorse isolation for its own sake. He encouraged awareness. The intelligent man without connections is not broken. He is simply unprotected. He sees too clearly to blend in effortlessly, but lacks sufficient clarity to transform his perspective into a functional strategy. His loneliness does not signify an endpoint. It represents a threshold, a signal that he has outgrown instinctual belonging, but hasn't yet mastered deliberate connection. Here is where the real transformation begins. Once a man recognizes that his isolation stems from structural dynamics rather than personal failure, something fundamental changes. He stops seeking inclusion as validation. He no longer confines his mind to spaces where it was never meant to fit. And then he begins asking a more profound question. Not what is wrong with him, but what types of alliances are worth pursuing in a world where most connections are built on convenience rather than authenticity. Crossing this threshold reshapes everything internally, even while outward appearances remain unaltered. He may still walk alone for stretches of time, receive few messages, or occupy the periphery of social circles, but he no longer interprets solitude as rejection. Instead, he starts to understand it as a natural process of filtering out what is incompatible. Machiavelli argued that every system ultimately excludes what does not conform, not out of malice, but to preserve itself. Society operates no differently. The intelligent man is filtered out, not because he is unwelcome, but because he cannot fully adhere to the emotional frameworks that stabilize most relationships. At this stage, many men face a critical pitfall, believing that if the majority cannot connect with them meaningfully, no one can. This assumption breeds either arrogance or despair, both dangerous traps. Machiavelli warned against these extremes in self-perception. The default framework of social life often proves incompatible with those who stray from its conventions. These settings prioritize agreement over truth, loyalty over insight, and emotional alignment over independent thought. To step outside these norms, whether by intention or instinct, comes at a cost, the loss of casual connections. And it is these casual bonds that form the bulk of what most label as meaningful friendships. The intelligent individual, however, seeks depth over superficiality. Yet, depth comes at a steep price: time, vulnerability, and shared courage. Most people do not shy away from depth out of superficiality, but because it threatens the identities they have meticulously constructed over years. Depth destabilizes, and few are willing to risk such upheaval. Machiavelli recognized identity as a survival mechanism, a mask tied more closely to utility than truth. People cling to beliefs not because they believe them to be true, but because those beliefs validate past decisions, justify current behaviors, and protect their self-perception. When someone of intellect questions these beliefs, even gently, it threatens the mask. And with the mask under siege, the person feels exposed and defensive. Relationships often deteriorate not due to disagreement, but due to this exposure. This dynamic explains a familiar pattern often observed by highly intelligent individuals. Initially, they are met with intrigue. Their conversations captivate, their ideas invigorate. But as familiarity breeds comfort, it also removes novelty's buffer. The same traits previously appreciated begin to feel overwhelming. It becomes clear that their way of thinking isn't momentary. It's a permanent lens. This realization can create discomfort for others, akin to living next to an unyielding mirror that reflects truths no one wishes to confront. Machiavelli postulated that people tolerate truth only when it serves or flatters them. Otherwise, they cling to comforting illusions. For this reason, high intellect often sees relationships evolve into transactional dynamics. The intelligent individual's company is valued primarily for specific utilities, advice, strategy, or perspective. Once this benefit wanes, so too does the connection. This reality can feel harsh at first, but also illuminating. It replaces sentimentality with clarity. While clarity is empowering, it brings the risk of cynicism. Recognizing the conditional nature of most friendships might drive the intelligent person toward isolation, preferring solitude over perceived futility in connection. Machiavelli would warn against such withdrawal, arguing that retreat is not power, selectivity is. There is a critical distinction between isolating oneself out of resentment and carefully choosing meaningful bonds that align with one's values and priorities. Without understanding this difference, the intelligent person risks embodying society's perception of them as cold, emotionally detached, and unreachable. Here lies Machiavelli's pragmatic wisdom. Understanding human nature is not about escaping it, but navigating it skillfully. The real issue for intelligent individuals isn't the absence of social bonds, but their idealistic expectation that such bonds exist beyond the bounds of human nature. Honesty without consequence, depth without discomfort, and unwavering loyalty without incentive. While noble, such expectations are unmoored from reality. Machiavelli would advocate adjustment, not surrender, but adaptation. This adjustment doesn't mean dimming intelligence or masking one's true self entirely. It means learning when to express intelligence openly and when to observe silently. Power, according to Machiavelli, lies in knowing when to unveil oneself and when to stay inscrutable. A common misstep for intelligent individuals is revealing too much too quickly in social contexts that reward conformity and predictability. Social groups organically assign roles, leader, follower, joker, listener, for cohesion. Yet individuals of high intellect tend to resist being slotted into these predefined roles. Their dynamic thinking inherently resists restriction. However, as Machiavelli might argue, rejecting roles doesn't grant freedom. It renders one undefined. And in systems that thrive on structure and definition, the undefined element is often excluded. Thus, the choice for the intelligent individual is not between authenticity and connection, but between two forms of authenticity: unconscious authenticity, raw and untamed, or strategic authenticity, purposeful and measured. The latter isn't manipulation in Machiavelli's view. It is wisdom. Reaching a state of true understanding requires withstanding the solitude without dulling its edge, without casting blame on others, or betraying your own essence. It demands a realization that loneliness is not always an indication to reshape who you are, but sometimes a signal that you are being molded for a deeper, more substantial level of connection. When this clarity emerges, when you genuinely understand that a lack of friendships is not a defect, but rather a phase dictated by heightened awareness, the question changes. It's no longer about why you lack friends. Instead, it becomes about who you are becoming in their absence, and whether you possess the resilience to see that transformation through, without retreating into comfort simply to escape the silence. That very silence is often the point where many falter, not because the pain is unbearable, but because it eradicates all distractions and exposes one's unfiltered self. In those moments of quiet, when external validation fades and there's no stage left to perform on, a man is forced to confront his essence. Few understood this internal reckoning as well as Machiavelli. He realized that solitude reveals one's character far more swiftly than conflict ever could. With no constant reassurance, a man either sharpens himself or allows his edges to dull. There is no room for stagnation in this space. This is precisely why the solitude of an intelligent man is both perilous and profoundly transformative. For most, social interaction isn't driven by a love for people, but by fear. Fear of their unrelenting thoughts, their unresolved questions, and the startling clarity that emerges when there's no one left to distract them. Higher intellect does not exempt one from this fear. If anything, it accelerates its arrival. An active mind does not quiet in isolation. It sharpens, and this sharpening can cut in two very different directions. One path is the way of resentment, where a man begins to see the world as shallow, others as inferior, and relationships as futile. He mistakes his ability to recognize patterns for wisdom and detachment for superiority. But Machiavelli would deem this viewpoint a grave misstep. Resentment clouds judgment. It impairs perception and blinds one to opportunities. A man consumed by contempt can hold no real influence over others, and influence, after all, is a measure of true power. Intelligence without influence amounts to little more than isolation crystallized into irrelevance. The other path is far rarer but vastly more impactful. This is where solitude becomes a tool for honing perception rather than inflating the ego. The intelligent man learns to study humanity without malice, observing its behaviors and social constructs with clarity, but no need for dominion. Over time, he understands that people are not inherently shallow. They are simply shaped by fear, routine, and survival instincts. Crucially, Machiavelli did not despise humanity. He merely chose not to romanticize it. This distinction carries weight. A man who idolizes others becomes naive. A man who despises them becomes blind, but one who truly understands them can wield great influence in the world. It's at this point that the intelligent man recognizes why friendship once eluded him, not because others were unworthy, but because the context was incompatible. He sought depth where only comfort was offered. He valued honesty where reassurance was the preferred currency. He played an entirely different game on a board designed for trivial exchanges and couldn't understand why his moves were penalized. As Machiavelli might suggest, it's the board, not the player, that dictates the rules of the game. This realization alters how the insightful man navigates life. He no longer expects intellectual or emotional resonance from most people, and as these expectations fade, so does the disappointment that once soured his connections. He becomes lighter rather than burdened, more composed rather than colder. He understands that withholding depth is not an act of self-betrayal. It is an act of conserving energy for spaces and moments that matter. Reaching this level requires enduring years of what may feel like social exile, years of self-doubt, questioning whether there's something fundamentally flawed within oneself, and watching others thrive socially within systems and schemes the intelligent man could never bring himself to partake in. However, comparisons during these times only serve as poison. Machiavelli cautioned against comparing outcomes without analyzing underlying strategies. Often, those who are socially flourishing have paid a price the intelligent man refuses to pay. A surrender of depth for fleeting acceptance, or trading long-term inner coherence for short-term belonging.